I'll start. Okay, there we go. So, hello, welcome to the day 8 of the workshop, joint OGC W3C workshop on maps for the web. I'm Peter Rushforth, and we have a concluding program today that is very exciting, and then we're gonna have a discussion about conclusions and next steps that we hope will have a bit of an open mic opportunity during that session. So I'd just like to remind everybody that we can chat on Gitter. Live chat is welcome there, and I've pasted the URL to the Gitter chat in the Zoom chat. We can use the Zoom chat for comments if you don't have Gitter access, but mostly just for Zoom problems or what have you, audio problems, that kind of thing. And we do have a discourse forum category set up for web mapping, and I'll paste that into the chat as well. And we have been adding topics for each of the sessions and linking to presentations and videos and slides as they become available. And we'll go ahead with doing that for tonight's work as well. And with that, I would like to introduce our, first of all, I'd like to remind everybody that the workshop is operated under the standards of professional conduct of the W3C, and there is a link on our workshop website at the bottom of every page that I'll paste into the chat window. And remind everybody to adhere to that, please, so that we don't have to mute you and boot you. All right. With that, I'd like to hand over the stage to Terence Eden, who's going to give us a talk on user research on maps in HTML from his perspective. And that's the only talk of the night. We'll pass it into the panel after Terence is finished. So Terence, if you'd like to share your screen and take over, that'd be great.
Thank you very much. So in time-honored tradition, I'm going to start by saying, can everyone see my screen? You should see a big hello, my name is. Is that on the screen?
We do, yeah.
Yep, I can
Fantastic. See it. There we go. What an auspicious start. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, participants from around the world. Thank you so much for having me today. My name is Terence Eden. And for a bit of background on me, I was the UK government's representative to the W3C's advisory committee. But for the last 18 months, I've been working with the UK's National Health Service to improve their digital capability. This talk is in a personal capacity and doesn't represent the views of my employers, past, present, future, or theoretical. So,
sorry to interrupt, Terence. We're actually seeing your presenter's view. Okay, but if
how interesting.
You want to just share the slides?
Thank you for letting me know. Right. Let's see if I can share my entire screen or if that's just going to be black.
Good observation, Amelia. There's a black screen.
That's just a black screen. Brilliant. Thank you, Zoom. Right. Okay. Well, in which case, just give me 1 second. Oh, I have too many monitors and not enough fingers, it would appear.
My apologies, I should have caught that for you, but...
No, it's all right. So hopefully you can just see a thing which says mapping our users.
That's it, yeah.
And you can't see all of my top secret notes I've written to remind me what I'm saying. So
No.
the illusion is maintained.
But we also can't, we only see part of your screen. It's cut off, at least.
Yes, that's true after the O in mapping hour.
Is that any better?
Yeah, slightly better.
Well, not it's better, but not
Fine. You know what? Then in which case I will if you just give me 1 second, I know exactly what I will do. I will do it the old-fashioned way. I'm so pleased that you're recording this, Peter, because that means that all of this will be preserved
But
for
fortunately, we
future
have
generations.
a very capable editor in Ted Guile who clips and snips as appropriate.
So, is that showing just mapping our users now?
Mapping.
Nope.
No, you're still cut off.
Sorry, just give me 1 second. This, you wouldn't believe it, this did work in rehearsals. And
So is there a fit to window in your view options thing?
just give me 1 second. Let's see what's going on here.
Ted, do you have an idea?
Well, in which case I will just do it.
We'll do it off the notes page.
Yeah, there we go. So
Oh no,
you can probably just see the whole.
In fact, we
no.
can only, it is still cut off.
And it's cut off in the same place.
Okay, in which
Does
case
P-
I'm very sorry about this. I'll try doing it off the PDF. Who knows? Maybe it's just an issue with my Chrome. So
Or if Peter has a copy of your slides,
do.
he can.
I have the PDF on the website here.
okay, well I'll just give it a go with this. I'm application window. Is this cut off?
I hate to tell
Yes.
you, it's worse. We're only seeing a quarter of your screen.
Terence,
Amazing.
Why don't I do the PDF and you can say next slide?
Next slide, please. That sounds like a brilliant plan. Right, I shall. If you want to take control of the screen share.
Yeah.
With Tin Constellation, I had a similar problem from Firefox.
Do you see the slide now?
I can see hello, my name is. I hope everyone else
I
can.
see it.
Yes, I can.
Right, well, listen, let's just cut in here. Hi, everyone, and welcome to a completely seamless presentation. My name is Terence Eden, and bit of background, I was previously the UK government's representative to the W3C, but for the last 18 months, I've been working with the UK's National Health Service. This talk is in a personal capacity and doesn't represent the views of my employers. Next slide, please. So I've been following along with bits of the workshop as my time zone allows, and I've really enjoyed what I've seen. But I think there's a way to make these proposals even better, and that is talk to our users. I've read through lots of the documentation that have been presented and some of the proposals, and I see lots of use cases and user stories, but what I don't see is any evidence that people have spoken to end users. And in this talk, I want to explain why engaging early with users is a good idea. Next slide, please. So developers are users too. We often think of the user as being the person who is scrolling on their screen or interacting with an app, but actually for the sorts of proposals that we're talking about here, we're not just targeting end users, not just targeting people who interact with a web page. We have to make sure that we have done the hard work to ensure that developers can adopt this and want to adopt our proposals to make sure that they are included in our user stories. Next slide, please. Look, we're all nerds here, right? I can say that because we're all good friends, but we're all nerdy about something. And I think we recognize the sentiment expressed in this mug, which says Linux is user-friendly. It's just very picky about who its friends are. Look, this isn't about Linux, but specifically, but all communities are picky about who they let become users. If you don't know the right jargon, or if you're a newbie, or if there's a high barrier to entry, it can be really intimidating getting started with something new. And this is a problem that HTML has as a language. And I want to take a look at a couple of examples of fairly newish HTML elements to see what we can learn from them. So next slide, please. So here are video and audio. So these are, I say they're new, they're introduced in HTML5, but they still feel new to me. They have basically identical functionality. You know, it's an element, and there's sources inside, and they are expressed in identical ways, and they both take control options, and they've got a similar layout to the classic image element. When I teach HTML to newbies, they can easily understand what's going on here. And once you've learned how the video element works, you automatically know how the audio element works. They are, you know, really simple to understand, really simple to use, and they get a lot of traction because of this. Now, let's take a look at an opposite example. Next slide, please. So this is picture, and if you're not familiar with this, you know, it's an extension to image, sort of. It's kind of confusing to try and explain it to people. It's sort of superficially similar to audio and video, but it contains some really weird syntax. So it has significant white space and significant punctuation. There's a media attribute, which sort of looks a bit like CSS, but isn't really, and it's not used elsewhere. And why does this use source set when other things use, when image uses source, src, there's no alt attribute natively. You know, when you teach this to people, they find it confusing. You look at Stack Overflow or MDN documentation, people find it, developers, users find it hard to use a picture element. And I think that's one of the reasons why it doesn't get much use. And I think part of the problem is that when this was being developed, and I had a very peripheral role in talking to people while it was being developed, is standards experts talked amongst themselves. They didn't perform research with developers. And we need to, because if we need to make sure that people want to use our product, and the only way they'll do that is if they understand it. And the only way they'll understand it is if we do the research to see what their needs are. So next slide, please. This is a slide which Peter presented earlier, and I love it. If I was designing the map element, this is almost exactly how I would develop it. And that's why it shouldn't be like this, because I am not the average user. My opinions shouldn't matter. Even more importantly, the opinions of everyone on this call shouldn't matter. We are all maps nerds and standards nerds and HTML nerds and nerds of some sort. And it's not about us. It's not about people who spend their days thinking about maps. We need to think about people who are being told by their boss, hey, I want a map on the website and it needs to do this. And they don't want to get into the semantic discussion of, 100 different things. They want an element which they can really easily pick up and use, and yeah, is powerful, but hasn't necessarily been designed for the needs of mapping nerds and standards nerds. So I want to talk about how we get around to doing that. So my plan was actually to spend the last 6 months talking to developers and other users to see what they expected from new elements. But as some of you may have noticed, the world has had other plans for the last 6 months. So next slide, please. Here are some of the questions I wanted to ask, and I suggest before going much further with these sorts of with this proposal, that the group engage either a proper user researcher or do some really quite structured, albeit informal, user research to ask these questions and others, because these are the questions I would want asked of me if someone asked, what should be in a new element. So next slide, please. I guess the very first thing is, what should this element be called? So I saw map earlier. I've been doing HTML since before my beard was a lot shorter. And does it make sense to recycle map? I saw map book earlier. That's interesting. Do people understand what a map book is? Is this actually a geo thing? Is this about geography? Would this make sense as an emoji? Why can't we have an emoji element? Would that be interesting? Would people get that intuitively? We know that the majority of web developers in the future will speak Chinese. That's a sort of almost demographic certainty. Will this idea get more traction if this is the first Chinese element, the first element with a Chinese name? I don't know the answer to that. You don't know the answer to that. The only thing we can do is speak to users to find out what they expect this to be called. Next slide, please. And there are some things inside the element that Peter had shown, lat lon. Why lat lon? Is that what developers want to see? Do they want latitude and longitude? Not everyone speaks English. We're not trying, you know, we don't have to save every single byte. What other coordinate systems are being used? People in the UK might want to use ordnance survey grid references rather than latitude and longitude. So perhaps we need to talk to users to say, you know, not just the design of what mapping things we can put there, but the actual names that people want to use. I mean, if I'm Googling for something, do I know what lat and lon are? Why isn't it lat and long? It's worth talking to users to find out what they want. Next slide, please. The Zoom thing I found really interesting. So I did chat very briefly to people just before the pandemic kicked off about what they thought Zoom meant. And it's really interesting. Some people think that Zoom 0 means there is no Zoom, so you're zoomed all the way out. And others say there's no Zoom, so you're zoomed all the way in. What's the consensus here? There's what people use at the moment, but there's also what people expect. There's also what other systems use. Should Zoom be an integer? Should it be a number at all? Perhaps when people are saying Zoom, what they mean is fit it to the screen. Again, what our expectations are of what zooming is in a mapping context can be very different to what a developer thinks. And you know, it's very different to how other elements work, and that may be where their mental model is. If we don't understand the mental model of people who want to use this element, we're going to end up with a mess. Next slide, please. Here's another one. So controls. This is something which I think the video and audio element have got wrong. They have a binary state controls on or off. And what that means is that little bar at the bottom, which allows you to play and pause and fast forward and stuff, you can turn that on and off. But is that fine-grained enough? What controls do users expect? So end users might expect to pinch and zoom and pan and things, but what other controls might a developer want to see in there? Which ones would they want to turn on and off? Does it make sense to say, I want this map to be pannable but not zoomable? Maybe, but we won't find that out unless we actually talk to people and find out what controls not only do they want, but do they expect to be able to enable and disable. Next slide, please. So there are lots of existing solutions out there. I mean, I used at least half a dozen different HTML map things in the last year. Can we say, let's just take the best bits of each? Well, yeah, but then we're only scratching our own itch. We need to speak to the customers and the users of the existing solutions and say, hey, what do you love about the current mapping solution? And then, even more importantly, what do you hate about your current mapping solution? If any of you have done product development or worked on a new business, you know, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is look at your competitors and ask the customers, what don't you like about that? And if you can be the opposite of that, if you can do the one thing well that others can't, that's how you get traction. Because I'm literally wearing a t-shirt which says this, you know, users first. We can't rely on our own instincts. Our own instincts are wrong because we think too much about this. If you look at the, you know, there are some bizarre HTML elements which have been put in, as far as I can tell, because nerds like us said, oh, it would be really good if, without actually talking to people and seeing if there was a absolute user need and whether they would get traction. And I think that mapping is too important to fall by the wayside like that. This is why we absolutely have to do user research. Next slide, please. So who are our users? Do we know? I mean, have we spoken out to people? If this proposal gets into the standard, but nobody uses it, it will be a failure. And, you know, we'll kind of have wasted all our time. Yes, we'll have done something that's very technically interesting, but if it doesn't get use, then there was no point to any of this. So I want to make sure that we together as a community create a proposal that developers will love. And the best way to do that is to speak to them before we go too far down the path of creating something which satisfies our needs. Next slide, please. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for bearing with me through the technical difficulties. And I think we probably have time for a few questions.
Sure, we could take a couple. That's a great presentation, though. Thank you very much. I agree. We need to get our domain in front of more developers to explain the possibilities and have people help influence it. I mean, part of the challenge of a community group is battling a low profile. And I know there are vehicles for reaching out to users. Typically, the Mozilla Web DNA survey is a vehicle for reaching users or reaching developers. But I think part of the challenge is that web map developers don't see themselves as web developers in some cases. You know, there are some high-end professionals who are high-end web developers, but they are the intermediaries for web developers, right? They just want to have that element. That hopefully is not a div.
No, yeah. Thank you for that. So I'm just taking a quick look through the getter thing. It is entirely possible I'm mistaken about the history of the picture element, it turns out. But I will reiterate, you know, when I teach HTML, again, I see it as that particular element as a huge barrier to entry. And I appreciate there's a lot of historical baggage, but we potentially have a new chance here of creating something which doesn't have that. I see Brian doesn't want to have to type latitude every single time. That's a valid thing, but again, Brian, you are possibly not the average user. I don't want to type latitude every time, but again, I'm not the average user. It's worth chatting to people, especially people where English isn't their first language, to see whether they actually understand why things are abbreviated the way they are. So do we have any questions either here or in the chat, or shall we move on to the next?
Well, maybe we can move on and you can take some questions in the chat because that's what it's good for.
I shall do. Thanks for listening, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you for your presentation.
Actually, Terence, it's Chris. It's Chris
Hey,
Little.
Chris.
Hi. I was going to. One of the things about asking users really made me change my view. We're having a discussion in a geospatial community about the third dimension. Like GeoJSON allows you to add Z, or Z,
Yeah.
the vertical coordinate. And as a Spanish speaker, he said we should use altitude. Not elevation, because elevation is used for angles above the horizontal as well. But he said the real reason is because it rhymes with latitude and longitude.
You know what? Mnemonics
And that's
are
the
a
best
really
reason I've
powerful
heard.
thing. So yeah, I would go with that. I've never heard an argument of development from poetry before, but I'm all for it, Chris. I think that's a brilliant idea.
So I also asked a question in the channel. Can I ask it?
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed it, Brian.
It's okay. So I actually I really like a lot of your presentation. I agree with very much, even if I disagree with a couple of details in the getter. But I guess I would like to know more about what you propose in terms of what it means to talk to users, because this has been a thing that I have been really focused on, and it is like actually tremendously hard if you can't give them a thing, because once you give people a thing, they begin exploring it, and
they focus.
And like once they have a tool and they can explore it, they often do more interesting things than you intended, which is impossible to do in the early process, right? This is one of like also why you get like one of the famous quotes about like faster horses, like people ask for faster horses, right? But if you give them a car and you say like, what do you think about this? Then, you know, they begin doing interesting things and giving you good feedback.
So part of this is, yes, we have to invent the future, and we are much like Star Trek, going where no one has gone before. And sometimes we're going to have to produce something which is so new and confusing to people that it will take time for them to adopt. That being said, one of the problems I see, and I keep an eye on incubators, and I'm also on the Google's AMP advisory board as well, is people come along and they say, we've got this brilliant idea for a new element, and it sounds really interesting, and you say, okay, what do developers think about this? And they go, oh, we don't know, we just thought about it inside Google or inside Yahoo or inside whatever. And that's no way to do standards driven development. So what I actually propose is a couple of things. One is make a very user focused part of whether it's GitHub or somewhere else, where you can say, look, here are some of our proposals. What do you like? What do you dislike about them? Go and find user groups where people are either getting started with HTML or are quite experienced, and ask them very specific targeted questions. Now, I'm completely upfront. I am not a user researcher. I don't even play one on TV. I would recommend finding either a freelance one or a professional one, and getting them to design, even just a questionnaire that you can put in front of people so that you can start gathering information about what people want. And again, looking at the demographic of the participants, I don't see a lot of names which are sort of outside Europe. I see a few which look like they might be, but we are not. It's not the Western World Web, it's the World Wide Web. So we need to find a way to go out and reach web developers all around the world, to ask them what their mapping needs are. One particular thing which I find interesting, and again, this isn't a professional employer comment, is different countries recognize other different countries. And I'm not going to get into which countries recognize which, but if you're a mapping developer and you're asked, would you like this HTML mapping solution? One of your first questions might be, does it show that this country is separate from that country? Because if it does, I legally can't use it. So that's why we need to speak to a wide variety of people, because otherwise we'll end up with something which can't be used in certain countries. Sorry, I've gone off on a bit of a tangent there. Okay.
We do have the Maps for HTML community group, and we convened the workshop of, this is a worldwide workshop. So like everybody is welcome to join the community. I realize that that's not like user surveys or anything, but we hope that people will come and help us solve these issues, right? Debate them, put issues in about them, suggest ways to get definitive data on stuff. Now I know that there's the HTTP archive and so on, and so there's lots of tools.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways your custom element goes.
Okay, sorry.
And other mapping custom elements go further because it meets developers where they live, right? And it says, like, here's a thing, and what do you think about it? It's very easy for them to explore and comment on what they don't like about it. And so this is the interplay with what he was just speaking about that I was curious about, like if there were thoughts on how we could do that better, because like talking about real concrete things and what is your experience, what don't you like about them, how could they be better, is actually the economics of getting people involved is way more practical.
Okay. So Simon has a question.
Yeah, or it's more of a comment really on the topic of how do we get feedback from web developers before it's like shipped in browsers. And one way to do that is already part of the process for Chromium, and they call it origin trials. And that's an opt-in mechanism, so you can use a new feature before it's shipped to everyone. and they collect feedback from the people who opt into this origin trial and iterate on the API design. So that's one. It's a bit, maybe a bit, it could be earlier or late in the process, depending on what happened before that. But it could be early if you start with an implementation in Chromium.
Yeah, cool.
Good points. Yeah.
Let's start with Canada.ca. Okay, that's great. So I think we have a really interesting panel coming up. So maybe we can move on to that. And so if we do questions for that panel, maybe we could raise our hand in Zoom. I think there's a hand raising facility there, and we can organize questions that way if there is time for them. There will certainly be like an open mic session later on where we have to where we want to decide on future next steps kind of thing, and that might be a good way to proceed. I'm sure I've not gotten to everybody who would like to have been heard here, so I apologize for that. But let's hand it over to Tom Kralidis and his panel.
Great. Thanks, Peter. Okay, so great. So this is the panel for open source for web mapping. I'm the moderator for the panel, and we have Daniel, Simon, Andreas, and I'm not sure, is Will online? Will Mortenson? Okay, I sent him an email as well. Let's see if he's able to show up. Okay, so basically this panel, you know, in the context of this workshop, with regards to open source and web mapping, open source has been a long time proponent of the web mapping ecosystem, open source software. So, you know, there's servers, clients, serializers, parsers, you know, all sorts of different open source software in support of web mapping. So we've been doing this for a long time in various FOSS4G projects, as well as the OSGeo community. Lots of web mapping going on there for decades. In regards to this workshop and some of the discussions around sort of making maps and the map element, let's say, more of a first-class element. There's a lot of discussion around how can we get this standardized in HTML to, you know, it's all about lowering the barrier, and, you know, similar to the previous talk, lowering the barrier, users, making things easier for users. So how do we make maps first class in HTML and get that mechanism standardized? Once we do get that standardized, that needs to be implemented. Open source is also obviously part of the browser ecosystem. So adoption from those two communities is obviously key. So here the overall discussion is I guess what the relationships are, what the synergies are between those communities, and what opportunities exist to try to move forward you know, standardizing maps and in HTML in open source web browser projects, given a lot of the experience that we also have on the sort of FOSS4G side. So as Peter mentioned, we can take questions on the chat if folks want, but we'll start now. So at this point, I'd like the panel to introduce themselves and give, you know, your name, organization, background, and your role and relationship with open source, mapping, and browsers. So maybe we'll start with Simon.
Thank you. I'm Simon Pieters. I work at Bocoup, a web platform consultancy firm. I have experience working on web standards and conformance tests for browsers. Bocoup participated in the OGC Testbed 16 program to review the MapML proposals. So that's the context that brings us to mapping, but the experience with adding stuff to the web platform is also relevant.
Great, thanks, Simon. Danielle?
Hello, I'm Daniel Morissette. I'm a software engineer and president at MapGears. MapGears is my own company, so as the company grows, I spend less time coding and more time just doing admin stuff. Been involved in open source software since the mid-90s. I was introduced to the idea of releasing my source code instead of selling it by Frank Warmerdam. At the time I was writing GIS data translator, and I've been involved in the GDAL and OGR libraries with him when he created it. Then later on I started doing web mapping, tried a couple of proprietary black boxes. Some people may remember the names of MapObjects and MapExtreme. The early versions, I mean. The later versions were better, but I'm talking about the ones in the late 90s. I quickly gave up and came back to open source for web mapping as well, and I never looked back after. So around 2000, I joined the University of Minnesota Map Server project. I helped set it up as a truly collaborative project with Steve Lime, who was the only developer at the time. Then I've been involved in OGC for a little while in the days of the WMS standard and the web map context stuff, which may remind some stuff to some of you guys with map context. Then I've been also involved in the Open Source Geospatial Foundation when it was created in 2006, and involved in some of the committees, the incubator, been on the board. So to sum it up, my connections are open source software development, mainly in Map Server and GDAL OGR, OGC standards, and OSGeo Foundation. Kind of 3 hats.
Great, thank you, Danielle. Andreas?
You're muted, Andreas.
Thank you very much. My name is Andreas Hocevar. I've been involved in geospatial web-based mapping projects that are open source since 2007, I think, or maybe even earlier. If I also think about Community Map Builder, an old web mapping project that is retired now. But the biggest project of those is probably OpenLayers, which I'm also a very active developer in. I'm self-employed basically, but I'm also director of a small company called W3Geo, which provides development and consulting for everything in the field of browser-based web mapping and web-based GIS systems.
Great, thank you. It looks like Will is trying to connect, so I'm sending him emails as we speak. But notwithstanding that, once he does get in, I'll sort of break and ask him to introduce himself and get him wired into the discussion. So let's see what happens there. So thank you for the introductions, everybody. And I guess my first question to the panel would be, Daniel, we heard you talk about OGC and, with regards to open source. In the FOSS4G community or in the geospatial community and sort of the web mapping ecosystem, when we relate that to the standardization of maps in HTML, what are the kinds of things that I guess the FOSS4G web mapping community can do in terms of helping with standardization?
Who should go first? Should I dive?
Sure.
Yeah, well, I guess that's one of the things that I did with the MapML stuff is testing the specs with the reference implementation. So in my case, anyway, for myself, reading a draft abstract document, like a spec document doesn't tell me much until I see it running. So kicking the tires, I guess, and making it possible for others to see what the thing looks in real life is probably one of the means by which open source developers can help test driving the specs essentially.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Andreas?
I think developers of web mapping related projects in particular can inform a standardization process for web maps by just talking about or providing different use cases, not only use cases, but also challenges that are related to implementing things. Right now, we're implementing things on higher level APIs. There's a chance of rendering web maps more efficiently with better performance if they are deeper baked into browsers. And I think this is an interesting process. There are very smart folks involved in the Mapbox GLJS mapping library. They wrote a brilliant WebGL based renderer, but WebGL is very low level. In OpenLayers, we use a higher level API, Canvas 2D. And I think the biggest chance in this case is to have a discussion about use cases, what's needed in rendering web maps, the whole topic of styling vector maps, of changing ways rasters are displayed. And there's definitely a lot of experience from developers of web mapping projects, whereas on the browser developer side, they know how to tweak performance on a low level in the browser. And I think there's many synergies. The problem I see right now is that we have, even on this panel, several developers that know about web mapping from the higher level API side and from how to use browsers, but we haven't really started the discussion yet with with browser developers. There are some things going on in the right direction. Like today, for example, there was an issue in the OpenLayers GitHub tracker about event sequences of touch events. And it was the first time that a browser developer suggested by themselves to look into how it's implemented in the browser to make it better suitable for OpenLayers instead of the other way around. So that's an interesting development, and I think we have to move way further in that direction.
So basically bringing forward more use cases, and I'm also hearing implementation is good proof of helping with the standardization. Simon, do you have any comments sort of from the browser side?
Yeah, just want to agree with the last thing Andreas said, that we really need, I think, browser developers and the map framework developers to talk to each other and get an agreement on use cases and requirements and how we can change the browser to better address those needs in a well-designed way. And if you want to help with standardization, what you really want to do is to participate in the standardization process. And that's often the first step is to talk about use cases and requirements and evaluate existing solutions and come up with new solutions. And then just discuss and get consensus or review proposals. And after that, the next step would be to write conformance tests and write an implementation in a browser engine and get it in the hands of users or developers to try it out.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not something that has or is very inclusive necessarily, or can seem like a world of you need a lot of know-how to participate in standards. And I'd like to share a link to a guidebook that we've written at Bocoup to create an on-ramp to standards work, essentially. I'll share it in the Gitter chat, but it's wpc.guide. It goes through all of the necessary steps for participating in standardization at different levels.
How far do we go along in, when you standardize something, do you show up with the implementation first, or do we come up with, do we get the standard to a certain point before people do implementation? It's a little bit of a chicken and egg, but what do you think about the sequence of those?
I think the sequencing should be to get alignment on use cases and requirements first with all of the relevant stakeholders at the table. So you want both browser implementers who are going to own the implementation on the browser side. If that's the goal, like if you want the feature to end up in browsers, you need stakeholders from browsers early on the process, I think. But you also need to have the developers who are going to use the feature, because without them, the browser implementers might come up with a solution that they think is great, but then it doesn't really solve the needs of the developers or the users. So and that's something that happens sometimes. So there's like a lack of communication early on in the process.
And Andreas and or Danielle, are there? I guess we have like a bank of use cases throughout the years, one way or another, that we can all work on, sort of on the open source web mapping side, that we can bring to the table with regards to end user cases. Is that accurate, or do we need specific targeted work to come up with all these use cases? Because that's effort as well.
Definitely an effort to build the complete list of all the use cases. I believe Amelia did some work on that with Peter, and I saw some of the work, and it's quite a job to try to identify all the use cases. And as Ivan showed in his presentation a couple of days ago, I mean, you can imagine a bunch of use cases that you've never thought of. So it's tough to have all the use cases, but I think it really starts with communication. That's the key thing. Simon pointed out that, get the web and geo people to start talking to each other. That's probably the big thing. I mean, in my case, I had never really talked to any browser people until this exercise with this workshop this week, but also some of the work that I did with Peter on using the spec. So that's, I guess, workshops like this one, and getting geo and web people to talk to each other is one thing. And then, as Terence said in his talk today, speak to users is a good lesson, not just for this exercise, but for specs in general. And if I may share an anecdote on that, on the OGC side, if we had spoken to users in the WMS 1.3 working group when the access order fiasco was done, for those who were in OGC on those days, so the WMS spec was a very, very simple way to create a URL to request a map for a given region. And to meet ISO compliance, the WMS 1.3 working group decided that we had to abide to a big database of projection coordinate system, which meant that latitude and longitude, well, what used to be longitude and latitude, X and Y, would now be latitude and longitude, because when you talk about the coordinates in degrees, you have to talk about latitude and longitude, because that's the way the database specifies it. Anyway, this sounded like a good idea for compliance, but for the users, for the simple implementations, like the simple WMS clients that were trying to implement the spec, it became a nightmare. And it's been a nightmare for about 10 years of trying to explain to people, why does my map not show up at the right place? I even wrote a rant on my blog at one point about this. So this is a perfect example of speak to users to validate your ideas. Maybe not to get all the ideas, but at least to validate them before you adopt your final spec. That's anyway, communication, a good point. It's a good lesson that
That's a good. Yeah, I'd have to agree with that. I will say on my side that the OGC, the current evolving OGC API standards, I think are going in the right direction with regards to that. But I share your pain about the access order and those memories, Danielle, for sure.
Same here, and unfortunately, it continues with other OGC standards as well. But I couldn't agree more with Daniel about communication here being key. And I would say compared to other big players on the market, OpenLayers, the mapping library that I'm involved with, is a small player. And I think way bigger players like Google with Google Maps or Apple with Apple Maps, and both are way closer to browser development than any of our Phosphor-G projects are. So to get those big players on board would be awesome. I don't know what it would take to achieve that, but then the whole movement would really gain momentum, I think.
Mm-hmm. I think Will has joined. Will, are you online? I think you're muted. Just want to loop Will into the conversation here. Okay. Well, oh, Will.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I've had all kinds of to my phone, and it's kind of wonky. So I apologize for being late.
No problem. You just want to, or sort of midway here, do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Will Mortenson. I'm the volunteer geographic for AAA, National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Largely what I do is focus on a lot of open source technology and capabilities that are out there to basically help our foundation mapping missions at NGA.
Thanks a lot, Will. Okay, so we're carrying on. We heard a lot about use cases and the differences in size between Phosphor-G sort of web mapping community of developers, as well as the bigger browser players. We talked about process, legitimizing ideas, coming up with proposals, and working together. But we especially talked about communication to talk between these various communities, which is obviously key. What are people's ideas or thoughts around how do we cross-pollinate and raise participation between these two communities? I mean, working on open source web mapping software projects is one type of thing. Browsers, I'm not really sure, but I'm interested to learn. How do we raise participation of web mapping folks inside the browser projects, and vice versa? Beyond just the standards. I mean, how can we lower the barriers to getting those two groups to work together?
So I can go first. I have one additional thing that I didn't mention, but I think will help with getting participation or interest from browsers, at least, is to try to look outside of the map box and apply use cases for maps to other problems, right? Because a feature that benefits maps might also benefit 3 other use cases that have nothing to do with maps. And for example, if you take the panning functionality that maps have, which is kind of similar to scrolling, but it's a bit different as well, because a map you can pan around and then end up at where you started, which is kind of like infinite or looping overflow. So that's something that maps need, but there are other use cases that also want to use that feature. If you take an image carousel, where's a part of a page that has images automatically flowing by. At the end of that, you want the first image to show again. And that's kind of hard to do right now because there is no concept of looping overflow. But finding those common use cases between different needs automatically gets interest from other areas that aren't even related to maps in the first place.
That's a very good point, I think, and I can tell from my experience with what people use OpenLayers for, that one thing that happens very often is people use OpenLayers for deep zooming into images. So they provide their images in from low to high resolution, so they can really zoom in very deeply. OpenLayers has been used for displaying microscopic images from electron microscopes, and way more, even dashboards for warehouse robots, which are maps to some extent, but also not geographic maps in the sense that we know. So that's a very good point, I think.
There's a lot of knock-on effects to that.
Are there any opportunities, like, you know, do browser projects have you know, do they have code sprints or hackathons where potentially some of the web mapping crowd can you know, can attend, or are there opportunities for co-location? I know in OSGeo and the FOSS4G community we have a number of you know, code sprints and hackathons to work with software, and that's a nice way of cross-pollinating between you know, the open source geospatial community. What kind of things or opportunities exist sort of on the browser side to do that kind of thing?
I saw that.
Yeah. So. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I saw that Brian wrote in the chat that Igalia has a Hackfest, and actually the Hackfest for Igalia, I looked it up, was taking place the week before the OSGeo Code Sprint, which was planned for May this year and was canceled. And I think Igalia's event was also canceled. So there may be potential, I was thinking about that, potential for getting people from both sides to meet in one of those events. Mm-hmm. And I'd add to what you said, Tom, that in the OSGeo case, we call them code sprints, but really, in my case anyway, I don't write much code. I spend a lot of time discussing features, not talking about beer, I see you smiling, Tom. Discussing features, discussing specs, like in the last, well, anyway, it happened that I used one of the last code sprints, OSGeo code sprints, to introduce a bunch of people to the MapML stuff and get some feedback, which I brought back to the working group after through Pieters. So it's, you know, even though we call it code sprint, it's not just about code. It's really more about getting coders together to make decisions. I don't know about the Igalia ones or others. It would be interesting to hear about the other type of events on the web browser side to see where we can fit there.
Yeah, so I was just mentioning that we have the Hackfest that you can definitely come to. I know we had a few people from the mapping community who were planning on coming to that, actually. But that's a good way to do that. There's also other events, like there have been historically some like extensible web events that are intended to bring developers and implementers and standardistas all together, and they have like breakout sessions that talk about things, and you'll get some fast feedback, but it will ultimately probably be a lot like the feedback that you've gotten so far. like that there are useful and interesting things that are smaller, more known quantity things that benefit many, many, many use cases, and those are good steps toward breaking your problem down. That they would be the things to start with, probably.
I would just add, I'm not a programmer type either. I more gather requirements from customers and users, but I would think that as a government guy, I don't necessarily know everything that's great and wonderful in the world. And so if I had the ability, or if we had people that could, from the public side, that could stress why certain things are important, and get those advocates inside the government that actually have a pocketbook that can afford to contribute some dollars or some money towards these efforts, I think that would be important too, because I know at my particular organization, we have held hackathons in the past for specific events, and we do put out challenges now as well for certain geospatial type activities. So just my thoughts.
But like, I guess the other thing that I was trying to get to is that there, like, if you want people who can help you find avenues in the web platform where there are things that could be spec'd, like there are a lot of people who do that. Amelia does that, and Bocoup does that, and Igalia does that, and there's like a small community of people that you can reach out to do that. Like if you want to actually get implementers time and talk about why things are complex and like what their costs are and what kind of technical challenges you would have, Igalia is a consultancy, and you can like if you want to talk with implementers, we are implementers, you can contract and talk to us about that.
No, I understand that, but what I'm saying is I don't know that people inside, I don't know that people have that same technical know-how inside of some of these organizations, especially the people that are making decisions. And so my point is that enlightening some of these folks through events like this and other type events, writings, documents, things that out to the public where people with their eyes on it, I think would benefit your group. Soliciting more input or soliciting or getting people to be more excited or interested in helping out. Because like I said, I don't know that everybody has the same technical know-how as a lot of you.
So we've got a question from Amelia, and the question is, based on implementation headaches, what are some of the specific browser features that are missing, which would make web map libraries easier to build?
In my opinion, the thing where browsers could help most would be rendering API that's more suitable for maps. I mentioned already WebGL, which allows you to build very fast, very responsive maps, but it's a very low-level API, and at least in the OpenLayers project, there's not really anyone with good enough WebGL skills. Maybe that will change. So we tried several times to implement a WebGL renderer, but for now we still stick with the Canvas 2D API, which is a generic drawing API for drawing on a canvas, arbitrary geometric elements. But a renderer that understands how maps work, especially vector maps, where you have geometries and you have styles and you apply styles to those geometry based on attributes and based on your resolution. That's something where existing mapping libraries could be made much smaller by leveraging higher level map specific rendering APIs that might exist in a browser.
On the other side, this is the second half of Amelia's question. Is there anything we can do on the geo side to make things easier without necessarily changing the browser? in terms of maps or features? What do folks have any? Will that have any impact, or are we at the point where we need to dive deeper into the browser?
To jump in particular, I was thinking, well, about the issue about latitude versus longitude and those sorts of inconsistencies between different data sources that just make everything more confusing, or different URL templates and formats. Is that a solved problem, or can we make a lot of the work a lot easier by getting better standardization on the geo format side?
That's a good question, which is where there's no clear yes or no, I would say. I've been following standards and formats that are available that could be used for expressing maps, starting a long time ago with SVG, which provides a lot of what's interesting for maps. But because SVG relies on the DOM and implements the whole DOM events, it's only suitable for relatively low amounts of data. And if I look at vector tiles, what we do today and consider it as the best way to transport vector data for rendering to the browser, there are many similarities that to SVG, but the gain in performance and better compression of the format for transport is because we don't use a markup style language like XML, and because we don't need the whole DOM and the DOM events. So I also saw a comment from Ivan Sanchez Ortega on the chat right now, where he says that you can get performance, accessibility, and community standards without putting more code in web browsers. That's definitely true. The only question is how low do you want to go API wise? So the standard answer these days is probably WebGL, which is very common for game developers. There are game engines that run entirely in the browser and don't have any performance problem, but WebGL is not accessible to all developers. It has more people familiar with in the gaming community than in the GIS or mapping or geospatial community.
I agree with what Andreas said about better compression or mechanisms that would allow us to pass data from the server to the browser in a more efficient way than a verbose HTML stream. I mean, we've been dealing with, in the geo world, we're dealing with very large data sets. It's been like this since, like we've always been dealing with very, very large data sets. So if a mechanism was, like in this case, in the MapML proposal, we're still dealing with markup with an XML type of syntax, and more efficient encoding would definitely help if there was a standard way of having it, of support of efficiently streaming or having a progressive loading of a binary encoded version of the data. That would probably help a lot. Yeah.
So, but like that's the wire format, but like how do pixels get painted green is a different question. And like what, yeah, I mean, like inside an element, you would want to base it ideally on something that exists in the platform. And I think the question is, what exists in the platform that you would build it off of today? And from the presentations here, and just my own like looking around, I could be way off, but it seems like there isn't entirely agreement yet. Like there are people who want to use Canvas. There are people who are interested in maybe using SVG because it has some good qualities. Like what you send across the wire isn't necessarily what you have to use to render, right?
Can I say something?
Sure.
I guess I would just pitch the web. You know, the web is ubiquitous. The web underlies everything, and it allows humans to express thoughts. It allows companies to express everything they need to express. And the world we live in is everywhere. It's everything we touch. It's every place we go. It's every place we are. Everything has a place, and we need to be able to describe it in much the same way that we describe ideas with the web. And so we need to leverage an existing standard platform using the same technology that integrates into the standard fabric of the web, not the JavaScript layer of the web, to describe our world. And I think we've heard that this is a desirable goal in the past couple of weeks from people in the AR and accessibility communities. And so like, I just want these things to have a plan for getting there from here. And so, like, that's all I want to say.
Yeah,
but like when you crack open many of the more complex elements inside are other bits of the platform, right? Like fetch underscores like everything that you use to fetch data, and we have primitives like streams and things like that, and even elements like video, like the players are built up of other elements inside, but you don't like have to send the insides across the wire or something. Like they can expand into more stuff. And if you do that, if you separate those concerns, it doesn't mean they can't be the same, but it means they could not be the same. So you can split the problem at the joint.
I see one question here from Brian Haberberger asking about HTTP2. Does anybody, what kind of implications would we have for putting maps in HTML and maps deeper into the browser from the perspective of HTTP2? Does anybody have any comments or thoughts around that?
Also, only a small bit of experience with OpenLayers. What really works better with HTTP2 is that loading data from multiple sources in parallel, like loading tiles for a map, is way faster with HTTP2 than with HTTP1, and that's something we benefit from already.
I can tell you, like, as proof of this, just today, I was looking at a Google Map on a device that only supported HTTP1, and you could pull the same thing up on the same device but supporting HTTP2, and the difference is incredible. Like, it's really a big deal. Well, what's the question about 3? Because 3 is sort of in process.
Yeah, the question was about 2, but 3 is indeed the next thing. But as Ivan said, it shouldn't affect HTML, and I kind of agree with that. It makes performance better if you're loading a lot of images, but it doesn't make anything else better. You still want to have interaction in the way that maps work with panning and zooming, and you want to have APIs that you need for maps and so on. And that's those things have nothing to do with what goes over the network. That's more what APIs and primitives are available in the browser to use, or in the web platform.
Another question. So imagine a world where we start moving toward getting maps deeper into the browser, and can we think about what the future could look like when, once sort of maps become first class in HTML and the browsers themselves? What is everybody's thoughts around, what does web mapping software look like once we get there? And how do we see the future of those communities moving moving forward? So let's say we gave the browser, we added the map element. What does that reduce in a web mapping library, let's say?
Well, it definitely lets us focus more on what we can do with maps, how we can make nice maps, how we can support users in creating nice maps if we can take the focus of the rendering. And the more I think about it, the more I like what has been said earlier in this discussion, that it might help to see a map or a map-like thing different from what we are used to, and really bring it to the basic concept of what we call a slippy map, which is panning and zooming an image, and maybe help with creating images from geometries with attributes, which is a bit more specific to maps, but not really to geographic. And with that in place, mapping libraries could probably develop in directions that we cannot even think about yet. But this strong focus on the rendering that we have now is definitely that is in the way of leveraging resources for other kinds of developments.
And the same type of evolution happened about 15 years ago when the Google Maps and Bing Maps came to the world. We on the server side, people were telling us, well, your web mapping stuff, that's gone, that's going to die because now maps are everywhere. And actually that just opened up access to maps. It democratized access. So I guess having maps as a first-class citizen in browsers in HTML would probably just open up a bunch of possibilities, just like it happened for before those days. Producing maps was really a challenge because access to data was hard. And for those who just needed to have a couple of points on the map, the Google and Bings and other service providers just solved the problem for them. And our server-side mapping engines became used for the more interesting and more advanced stuff. So I guess the same situation will probably happen on the client side. Once the browser takes care of the basic stuff, as Andreas just said, we developers will be able to focus on the more interesting features and solving new problems instead of just dealing with performance all the time.
And deal with access order and all that.
Well, I don't know if that one's ever going to go away. I mean, that's the difference between geographers and software engineers. We don't think the same way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But an example, videos used to be in Flash, if I recall, right? And then that became an element. And I'm sure whoever was doing JavaScript around those things was they kept going with interacting with that element instead.
Yeah, that's a good point. That reminds me of another thing I wanted to say in this discussion. All relatively new browser elements that we saw appear in the last couple of years have relative simple ways of interacting with them. For a video, it's basically making it full screen, going back and forth, going slow motion, going time lapse. The only format that I remember that had more interaction with it was VRML, which was a standard that died. And I do see this problem with maps as well. There are so many different ways to interact with maps and to add controls to maps. So if we think about a standard for that, we should maybe leave that to the application or a mapping framework around it, and really focus more on the rendering than on controls to interact with the map.
Mm. That's a good point.
And I think there are map implementations can vary quite a bit in their feature sets. Like in some maps, it's not enough just to pan and zoom. You also want to be able to rotate the map and tilt the map. Maybe you want to view a 3D view of the map. And how would you do that if it was a declarative feature of HTML? You wouldn't be able to go 3D without using WebGL again. And then the question is, how much do you need to re-implement if you need to do that? Are you still able to use the panning and zooming interaction model of the browser and forward that to the WebGL rendering? Or do you need to re-implement the panning and zooming as you have to do today? We need to be a bit careful about how we design these things so that if web developers want to use a solution that is slightly different, they won't need to re-implement everything, because that means that the solution wasn't ideal. Does that make sense?
Definitely, yes, because the way you control or you interact with something is always opinionated in some way. And I think native browser elements should not be too opinionated in how you interact with them.
No.
Great. I'm wondering, do we have any other questions from the crowd or the listeners?
Yes, I have. Okay.
I was just going to read out Fred Esch's comment, which kind of could be a question, is that he says, I don't hear anyone talking about how you relay the semantics of a map to a screen reader. So if the focus is all on improving rendering, like WebGL and Canvas, that where do we get the idea of communicating what the map actually means? And are we still relying on map libraries to somehow do that?
I think this is a great question and something that we need to seriously consider when designing solutions in this space. Maps should be accessible also to people who use screen readers. And it should be easy for web developers, in my opinion, to do the right thing. That is, if you create a map for the web in the simplest possible way, then it should be accessible by default. Insofar it can be, right? But for more custom rendering, when you use Canvas or WebGL, then accessibility is hard to get by default, but you would need to make it possible to layer in somehow. And I know that Canvas has already accessibility features that you can leverage with the focusable elements that you can tab between, but aren't being rendered on the canvas.
I see a question from Chris Little on augmented reality, saying, does the panel think that maps will only take off when AR does?
I don't think there is necessarily a connection between that. Maps are popular on the web already, and I don't see any reason why you would have to wait for AR. But maybe AR takes off before native web maps happen, so I think it could go either way.
Well, actually, I think that my thinking behind the question is that lots of people kind of are a bit fed up with the blue dot not being where they are on the map. And when AR takes off, one assumes they're going to have much better anchoring and better precision because there's no going to be global infrastructure until the next generation of satellites come up. And maybe that'll give the synergy. You know.
Yeah, maybe.
Any other questions or topics that people wanted to bring up or discuss? A very interesting panel discussion. So hopefully one day when we have maps in the browser and maps in HTML, I mean, there's many, data providers out there. There's over, certainly on the OGC side. I think earlier this week I was at ApacheCon and George Percival was mentioning that there's over 1 million OGC web services out there. So I think as we move forward and making those things easier on the OGC side and then making them easier on the browser side, maps can certainly has a place, a core place in the browser.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Maybe I missed it. It was addressed already. But like I heard on Twitter somebody say, never in 1 million years will Google allow maps to be integrated into, or not just, no, maps would never be integrated by the what working group, for the simple reason that Google, Microsoft, and Apple have spatial data infrastructures, private spatial data infrastructures. And I personally have not got that belief, but can the panel maybe talk about that from an open source perspective? Like, can they stop it?
I think I can talk to that. I mean, I can't talk to what Apple or Google will decide to do, but they can't really gatekeep what goes into HTML more than not prioritize implementing something in their browser engines. But so the standards themselves are open source and have their own government models. No one company has full say what goes into HTML. But also the browser engines aren't one-to-one to these companies. Chromium is an open source project that several companies contribute to and have it has a governance model that is not completely tied to Google. Google certainly has a lot of influence, but they don't have 100% influence over Chromium. With the Igalia are also contributing, and Microsoft are a big contributor. Also Opera and Samsung and a lot of companies are maintaining this project. And of course Mozilla is, or the Gecko engine that is behind Firefox is also open source. And for WebKit, the engine behind Safari, each of these have their own teams that decide what goes into each project. And if something is implemented in 2 browsers or in 2 browser engines, then it's de facto part of HTML or part of the web. And at that point, no company can say that it shouldn't go into the de jure standard, because it's part of the process to define things that are implemented.
So sorry, go ahead.
also, I think this statement on Twitter comes from a point of view that sees a map as the data behind the map, and like in Google Maps, key part of the map is all the information that you show, so the map itself, the map content. But we are talking about a way to display data in a map-like manner, and also OpenLayers is a mapping library that's only about the code to display maps, not about the data. So you can use OpenStreetMap for a street map, or you can use your own data and visualize that, but data is not part of the offering. And just the fact that you have a spatial data infrastructure, which is more about the data than the software you need to display this data, shouldn't stop anyone from making that part of HTML or of what browsers can do.
And I imagine, Simon, I imagine these the open source browser communities or the projects themselves, do they have like, I know in a lot of OSGeo projects we have project steering committees. I'm guessing there's the equivalent in the open source browser projects.
Yeah, and there's usually a defined process for adding new features that needs agreement from the API owners, or what they call it for each project.
Great.
If there really is pushback, and it's always hard to tell if it's true or just perceived from our standpoint, if there really is pushback from those organizations, those companies, it kind of reminds me of the vendor lock-in world we had in the GIS world about 20 years ago, where it was common practice for GIS software companies to have their own format, their own data format, their own data system, to force users into using the whole suite of their software and prevent them from migrating to another one. And open source has been the way to break that. So I guess open source implementations of whatever map standard we decide on, even if there was pushback from some companies, at some point they will probably end up being forced to just follow suit, because everybody's going to end up using the open source implementation. A good example of like a standard that did work and nobody could kill, even though it's simple and could be called flawed, it's the Web Map Service, WMS. Every vendor in the GIS world supports it. They have to. They can't not support it. And they can't even support it in a way that they break it, because it's too simple. So, and another example, the GDAL OGR file format library, it's breaking these data silos by supporting all the file formats and allowing people to go back and forth between the formats. And all the GIS vendors, all of them integrate. I don't think there's any one of them that, maybe Manifold, but I haven't heard of Manifold in a while. But I think all of them do use the GDAL and OGR libraries to read each other's file formats. So open source software can be a way to break the silos and create adoption. So maybe we just don't listen to those who say that there's pushback. We move forward, and if it's good enough, people are going to use it and it's going to win. I'm talking about if the map integration in HTML is good enough, it's going to win over time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're a couple of minutes over time. Any other final comments from the panelists? Okay. Okay. Well, I'd like to thank Daniel, Simon, Andreas, and Will for your participation in the panel. I would also like to thank the audience for bringing forward the useful questions, and I think we've had a good discussions here, and I really think we're at a crossroads or tipping point in terms of how to move maps deeper into the browser. So open source is obviously a big part of web mapping, and so is a big part of browsers as well. So let's see what we can do to try to marry those communities further in terms of the implementations and obviously the standards moving forward. So thank you to everybody, and thanks to the panel.
Yeah. I echo that. Thank you very much. Thanks for your participation, your willingness to play along. Yeah, so that brings us to the end of our workshop essentially, and I noticed Amelia unmuted, so like if she wants to just push me off the stage here, that would be fine. But the objective of the next segment of our discussion is to summarize and conclude and talk about next steps. So that'll be a bit more of an open mic idea.
Yeah, I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about logistically. So this is the last of our video conferences, but in a way it isn't the end of the workshop, because of course we're setting this up as much as possible to encourage asynchronous participation from people who couldn't call into the live sessions. So reminder that all these sessions are getting posted on YouTube. All the discussion is getting migrated over into theme topics on Discourse. And we're gonna try and keep those open for about a month. Well, I mean, they'll stay online indefinitely, but we'll be trying to gather up more discussion and comments and questions over the next month. So I would encourage everybody who has been engaged in the discussion so far, if you know of anyone else who would be interested in any of these topics, definitely point them to the videos, point them to the discussion. Let's keep the conversation going. This is not the end of the discussion of maps for the web. It's the start, or the start of the next stage.
Yeah, thanks, Amelia. So first of all, I guess I want to say thank you to everyone for participating over the past 2 weeks, and to say that it's a bit of a dream come true to have all these really awesome web map developers and graphics experts and web standards experts participate in a workshop that could talk about this subject. And I apologize if I dominated when I did, if I did. So, but it's really inspiring to have had all the inputs and the different perspectives. And so I just wanted to maybe reiterate some things that I think I learned from the past couple of weeks. And one of them is that one of the main takeaways for me is that accessibility is why web maps are actually important, potentially more important than they currently are, in fact. And you know, maybe accessibility is why augmented reality will be important one day. And so I think that those are two big takeaways for myself, and you know, it's going to definitely require more reading and understanding, and of course empathy, to come to a better understanding of these needs that are around web maps. And so I guess you know, part of the first thing I would like to ask the audience is, you know, are there other stakeholders that you can identify who should be looped into this discussion? I know we've talked about electron microscopy and images of various sorts, paintings and whatnot, things that are shareable, like image carousels and so on. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, do people agree that standardizing web maps is a worthy goal? I know some people do not. They think it's a bad idea, and that's a legitimate opinion. I hear something, dog panting or something. Okay, thanks. And then the other thing, you know, should maps become a first-class object on the web, like video, basically, along those lines. So we need to talk about that and share opinions and respectfully share opinions on that topic. And you know, if so, what are the next steps? Should we seek a working group at the W3C? Should we seek a joint working group between the W3C and the OGC? Or should we retrench back to the community group and do more research and development and you know, what are the next steps in the audience's view? So, okay, so I guess finally I would like to say that part of what I've realized is that, you know, my intent was to, you know, get big organizations to participate in this workshop in the hopes that they would say, okay, well, that's good, and get out a checkbook and start writing checks to make maps on the web a first-class citizen. But what I realized is that I got that backwards. So what has to happen, in my view, and I'll share that with you before we get our discussion going, is that the community needs to approach the big organizations and say, this is a worthy goal. Can you give us money to make it happen? And that's the way that this gets raised up on the radar of the decision makers in governments and funding organizations. And you know, with the evidence, I think that's being provided in this workshop, that case can be made. But I'd like to hear other people views on what that evidence is and the coordination that's necessary. So with that, maybe I'll turn it over to questions if we could, you know, somehow regulate the flow of questions and comments.
I have an observation. This is Doug.
Yeah.
I traditionally, W3C workshops, the ones I've helped organize, the ones I've attended, have done a summary of the proceedings at the end. It's a little bit less necessary since we've done videos and have everything available, which is not normally how it's done at W3C. But I think that might be a really useful next step for the committee and for anybody else who wants to contribute to make some findings report, some takeaways, future directions, things like that, that could help us set the next stage in the process.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that when talking about logistics. So when I said leave the discussion open for 1 month, that was within about a month we should start trying to write a report, because we have committed to have some sort of short summary report of conclusions. So that is on the table. Whether that report is just a summary of what was talked about, or whether it actually has recommendations and specific requests, that kind of depends on what happens here and what happens in the discourse, and whether we have an ability to identify clear consensus on what needs to happen next.
Yeah, and I sort of, I whiffed on the following topic, which was internationalization, and a comment that Brandon Yu made in his panel with Doug was that, you know, a lot of the rendering, text rendering and rendering intelligence that's built into browsers shouldn't have to be duplicated or repeated for the benefit of web maps, right? We should be able to leverage the existing centuries of work that has gone into those rendering engines, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I guess I think I heard that from Andreas earlier about rendering in general. So yeah. So the floor is open. people with comments about any of the aforementioned.
Absolutely. Hi, Peter. It's Brian. Hi, everybody. It's Brian.
Hi.
I just want to say, definitely, we're a group that works with the digital humanities, so a lot of cultural heritage, museums, libraries, and, that's a major stakeholder in this game, because you can just imagine all of them for any item in any collection. There are coordinates where it's been or is or some other way to, bring it to a level of understanding for someone who's just looking at a dot on a map. So I look forward to trying to bring this to my group, and I know I work with a lot of people who just are doing that basic get dots on a map on the web and get little implementations and try to do some proof of concepts and be there with feedback. Because I think, especially, and I'm speaking as a developer and definitely coming from the developer mindset, when I will be able to most help you is when I've tried to implement it and I know the little specifics. Because otherwise I'm just kind of coming in with trepidation and worries that I haven't even proved yet. So that's my immediate goal, is to try to find a way to get my little group together and maybe see if we can start to work together and show you how we implement, map stuff.
Yeah, that'd be great. Be sure to check out the web map custom element polyfill on the Maps for HTML community group.
Yes, absolutely. And I think most specifically, we would end up focusing on that feature element, which I know was kind of a taboo topic a little bit during this.
No, not at all. Adopt it. Make it your own. Like it needs a champion. Like there's just a lot in this proposal, right? So it needs champions.
Yeah. I've been looking for more and more evidence of sort of GeoJSON on the web, which is why, with this workshop, it was evident. It is a weird de facto thing that everybody's using, and to see that, we took on following it and that it can be parsed down into your markup language is great. It just means, a lot of stuff will just work with that little in between to figure out how to go, okay, instead of throwing it into a viewer that's going to absorb a JSON object, how can I realize that as a, MapML object and show it instead?
Yeah, again, it's a proof of concept at this point.
Yes.
Before it can be truly described as a polyfill, it has to actually work properly. So
yes, and I will test that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, those are good points, and it's kind of, there are sort of two sides to this story. We had a good discussion today now about rendering issues and low-level issues and trying to improve things from that end. But then there's the other end of the people who are content creators who want to post stuff on the web, and so they're coming from that side of what's the easiest API for them to express their content as something that they want to see on the map. And I suspect these things will have to move forward in parallel. So there are already the map viewer widgets like Leaflet and OpenLayers and the commercial ones as well, but they don't necessarily have the easiest APIs for a content creator. And so something like Pieters map element polyfill is basically just, it's currently done as a wraparound Leaflet, but it's a different API for sending your data to Leaflet. And there are other ways that could be done with web components and just playing around with what the markup could look like while reusing the existing mapping libraries as the rendering layer. That's something that could be done as a proof of concept and shipping to people like Brian's museum work, where they don't care about the rendering details so long as it's acceptably decent rendering, but they care about how do you describe your content. And so that's one end. And then we also have the other end where trying to get the map frameworks developers and the browser developers and web standards developers talking about improving the rendering layer and improving those lower level features. So sort of two streams of attack, I think, that will one day maybe merge in a standardized map viewer in the browser.
So like, just to harken back to the open source discussion and the open source geo community, we've tried to seed the idea in the OSGeo world by creating MapML implementations in GeoServer, MapServer, GDAL, OGR, because these are, I call them geospatial content management systems because they're clearly a server-side component. And, you know, I don't think anything is really changed on the server side. Like GIS is not threatened by maps in HTML. It's just another format, you know, a more natural format, like with less friction in theory. So, so yeah, I mean, this is why the Esris and the map boxes, I don't believe, should be threatened by maps in HTML because it's just another serialization format. Yeah, just the most important format on Earth in history of Earth.
You mean the most important feature of on Earth? You mean regarding Earth, right?
No, no, HTML. I'm talking about HTML. But anyhow, you knew that. You're teasing me.
Well, I'm saying, you know, it is, at least for a lot of purposes for maps, it is about Earth. It is the most Earth-related element that could be that we could have.
Yeah, for sure.
Knocking on Mars, Moon 2 for future colonies. So
Mars, Venus, yes, yes.
Yeah. I'm looking at the various outer moons of Saturn myself, as far as where to relocate, depending on the election results. But anyway, so I want to hear more from others. You know, how many, you know, well, Pierre acknowledged that, you know, there's some sort of, and they've been vocal in these proceedings, sort of opposed to this particular proposal. Heard various people agreeing that it's absolutely necessary, and then sort of in between some people that want to see some differences in how it's what's used and not trying to overload existing elements, for example, of HTML being one. So what do others think? How people who are here agree that this is worth pursuing, so we can sort of figure out how and next steps kind of thing.
This is Fred, and I've been listening for a while, and my background is data visualization, charting engines, and about 15 years in the mapping, charting, and geodesy community. But my most recent life has been in accessibility. And one of the things that I think that you're totally ignoring is the semantics, interactivity, and accessibility APIs that are needed for any native HTML element. And I just am not hearing anything about that. And I think widgets are fine. I can't see you convincing, having been on the ARIA working group and the Accessible Platforms working group, it's really painful to see APIs added or changed, and bringing in a new element seems like a humongous task. I think you really should focus on widgets that do things useful, and worry about a native element after you know what all your semantics, how to support interactivity for people that only use keyboards. And I mean interactivity, not zoom and pan, but investigate the features on the map. I mean, people don't just want to see a map, they don't want to see tiles. They want to be able to interrogate. Do you want to do line of sight? Do you want to do, you know, what is the thing next to this in the northeast direction? They want to know spatial relationships, and people need to be able to investigate that. Like maybe you would mouse over, but you need to do that with keyboards. It's all possible. But I don't think that any of the things I've heard, and I did miss the first hour on Wednesday, which is the one I wanted the most. But I just think this is big gaps, and you're just missing the whole, you know, whole need.
That's some very good points, Fred. And of course, we've worked together in the past on trying to describe the semantics of data visualization, and that never quite got into the browsers in any standardized way. But that is something else that needs to happen, is how can we describe geographic content in a standardized way, and how can we describe all the interaction patterns in a standardized way. And I think this is then a third path forward that should probably be happening in parallel, because all the existing map viewers need that. The work that has happened in the discussions about accessibility has made it clear that there is lots of potential, and there really isn't the standard right now that maps on the web as they currently are serving that need. So whether or not there becomes a standard map element to create a map viewer widget, work needs to happen about making the existing map viewer widgets more accessible to more people.
I'd like to point out that we didn't really address accessibility today, but this has been covered earlier in the workshop with the accessibility reviews of existing map widgets, and also I don't remember what their name was, but demonstrating what accessible maps can look like with if you're a blind user, with touch and audio or vibration, which was very insightful, at least for me. And I think it's something that we should consider supporting in somehow by default if we add maps to the web.
And Nick did say most of the map widgets fail most of the WCAG 2 guidelines that she listed. It was pretty terrible. Yeah. And audio, the only other thing I saw audio, I know that there was a panel discussion on Wednesday, which I missed, that I really wanted to see. But the main widget you put up there, if you have a map element, you should let a keyboard user go to the northeast to the next feature. If you have one feature and another feature and point features, they should be able to migrate around there just like you would and see a pop-up. You know, maybe there's a tooltip type functionality. A keyboard user should be able to do that as easily as a mouse user without making them go through the DOM order. That's just essential.
Yeah.
So
I agree, and I think this ties back to the discussion on use cases and requirements. Like, one of the requirements should be that maps should be accessible, and what falls out of that. Like, we need to have a discussion with the accessibility community and the people who have experience making web maps accessible, and try to apply that to whatever we design for the web, so that it's accessible.
Hi, this is Gobe. I think with this workshop, we've done a good job of, when I say we, I mean all the participants have done a good job of discussing you know, the need to get first class item browse.
I think with future events, we should also try to engage the hardware manufacturers. So those things that develop devices that enable people to interact. So not just like mouse manufacturers, but all the other devices that enable people to interact with applications. So making that bridge, from the physical world to the virtual world. So so maybe with future workshops, we should try and speak to some of those manufacturers. I know in the modeling and simulation community, there are a lot of devices that have come to the fore, but also in the research arena, that like brain to machine interfaces that are being researched on. So I think there are a lot of options out there that could make for a very interesting discussion on this topic in future workshops.
Thank you, Gobe. So I'm just going to paste into the chat a discourse item where we can share any more of our thoughts about the conclusions and next steps and so on discourse. And we're basically out of time. I know it's late very late for people in Europe, and maybe dawning in Asia. But anyhow, so I would like to give over to Ted from the W3C to maybe have a word about conclusions, and
looks like Wendy from the W3C is hoping.
Okay, Wendy, please, Wendy.
Well, I don't want to take away from Ted, and I'll hand it back to Ted. Just as strategy lead at W3C, I'm excited to hear the discussion here, and we'll welcome any follow-up that you have for places that we can fill gaps in existing standards work, or new work that you might like to see started at W3C. That the team is here to help.
Thank you very much, Wendy.
In fact, complimented. And yes, the program committee sort of met earlier and trying to figure out how and where to structure sort of what type of group. And Pieters mentioned it before. We certainly have the community group in the meantime while we sort of move towards the next step. So we don't have to wait until something gets set up. We currently have a mechanism to do so. In addition to discourse, so there's plenty of opportunity to sort of form these ideas. My big takeaway that there is enough common interest that this needs to advance in some form. There's certainly gaps, accessibility being a rather significant one that we identified we need to address better and figure out how to incorporate. And I guess additional sort of tweaks and features, but that's what takes place while you work on standards. We have a great starting off point thanks to Peter and Amelia and everyone else who's contributed to MapML. And really thank you for putting that on the table, and thank you for Peter, especially Amelia's certainly as well, and the rest of the program committee, Gobe, Doug, Ryan, so forth. And I'm missing lots of people, but lots of people have contributed to this. Various proof of concepts that have taken place as well. All the various speakers, and there's clear interest, and we just have to refine the proposal. But I where it can take place, and that was a voice of agreement from my dog. So she's giving a shout out to Peter. She and Peter are friends by now. Anyway, back to you, Peter. Let me go on mute while I can.
Yeah, well, that's good. All right, well, thank you all very much for making this a great workshop. And well, we'll see you on the chat forums and online. And with that, good night.
Thanks, Peter. Bye, all.
Bye, everyone. We'll see you around.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.